I see we still have some folks logging on, but I think we'll go ahead and get started if everybody is ready. Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for joining the latest event in our medical research and COVID-19 series. Before we start, just a couple of notes. First, you can start using the Q&A function now or at any point throughout the presentation to start submitting your questions, which we will take at the end. As a reminder, this briefing is not open to members of the press, so if you've joined us inadvertently, we appreciate the interest, but would ask that you disconnect at this time, and we're happy to follow up with you later. I'm Tanaz Rasooli with the Association of American Medical Colleges and Executive Director of the Ad Hoc Group for Medical Research, a coalition of over 300 organizations focused on the National Institutes of Health. We are very pleased to be co-hosting this series with the Coalition for Health Funding, which represents 92 organizations working to strengthen public health investment. Every day, we are seeing how the nation's investment in NIH-supported medical research across the country has been critical in helping us to eliminate COVID-19 and its wide-ranging effects. Our organizations launched this series to hear from the directors of NIH's individual institutes and centers about how past and future research can help inform our response to the pandemic, sometimes even in unexpected ways, as well as to hear about how the impact that the COVID is having on existing research across the agency's broad portfolio. It's my pleasure to introduce our two moderators for today's briefing. Caroline Powers is Director of Federal Relations at the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network and a member of the Ad Hoc Group Steering Committee, and she will be facilitating the Q&A portion of the discussion. But first, to introduce our speaker for today's briefing, I will turn things over to Lynn Bichon, who is Director of Policy and Practice at the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology of America and a member of the Coalition for Health Funding Board. Lynn, over to you.
And I apologize for my dog barking there in the background. CHF and the Ad Hoc Group are pleased to welcome Dr. Ned Sharpless, Director of the National Cancer Institute, to our 6th event in this series. Dr. Sharpless was officially sworn in as the 15th Director of the NCI in October 2017. Prior to his appointment, Dr. Sharpless served as the director of the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of North Carolina, a position he held since 2014. Dr. Sharpless was a Moorhead Scholar at UNC Chapel Hill and received his undergraduate degree in mathematics. He went on to pursue his medical degree from the UNC School of Medicine, graduating with honors and distinction in 1993. He then completed his internal medicine residency at the Massachusetts General Hospital and a hematology-oncology fellowship at Dana-Farber Partners Cancer Care, both of Harvard Medical School in Boston. After 2 years on the faculty at Harvard Medical School, he joined the faculty of the UNC School of Medicine in the departments of Medicine and Genetics in 2002. He became the Wellcome Professor of Cancer Research at UNC in 2012. Dr. Sharpless served as Acting Commissioner for Food and Drugs at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for 7 months in 2019, before returning to the NCI directorship. With that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Sharpless, to give an overview of NCI's current activities. When you're finished with your presentation, Caroline will open it up to our audience for questions.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I really appreciate the bipartisan support from Congress for cancer research over the years I've been in federal government. And that support has really been matched by the entire biomedical research community, really that seeks to work together to advance science for the benefit of the public health. I'm going to provide an overview today about cancer research overall, and I also wanted to focus on how we've sort of managed our research portfolio during the pandemic. And then I wanted to talk about some of the exciting science going on at the NCI in collaboration with other agencies like the FDA, BARDA, NIST, and CDC, as well as NIAID, to really advance the coronavirus research. So, but perhaps to sort of level set before I start, I'd like to mention sort of where we were in cancer research in February of 2020, before the pandemic happened. And I have one slide I would like to project, if you can put that up. Basically, before the pandemic, I was going around talking a lot about this extraordinary time in cancer research. And this is, based on my experience as a doctor taking care of patients with cancer, and then as a NCI director and acting FDA commissioner. I really, it's hard to explain to people the sort of excitement and enthusiasm that was happening in this extraordinary time in cancer research. And so here I've shown a bunch of metrics to kind of make that point. You see this in the top left, this remarkable increase in grant applications to the NCI that outpaces the rest of the NIH by a considerable amount, because new scientists are coming in with new ideas to the NCI to seek funding for cancer research. And in the bottom left, you see this remarkable growth in the sort of light green there at the bottom in the pharmaceutical investment in cancer research and cancer R&D. And then you see, this is played out then as record numbers of approvals of new therapies and diagnostics and devices for cancer in the FDA in 2018 and 2019. And I predict 2020, actually, despite the pandemic, may be the best year for cancer drug and device approvals ever in the history of the FDA. In May alone of last year, or of 2020, we had, I think, something like 8 new drugs approved for lung cancer only. It's just a remarkable time of progress against that disease. And then all of these new scientific discovery and new research investment and new approvals has begun to translate into measurable declines, real improvements in cancer mortality at the population level. And while it is not true to say we've made equal progress against all cancers, there are still some cancers that have proven very difficult to treat. Overall, cancer mortality has been declining substantially for decades, and that trend has really accelerated in the last few years. And we now know some of that acceleration is related to treatment effects, to new therapies that have become available for patients with breast cancer and prostate cancer and melanoma and lung cancer. And these are cancers that had terrible prospects, when I started out my career as an oncologist, and areas where we've seen real progress over the last few years. But those last few years of progress has been built on decades of very elegant and painstaking cancer science that has led to this biomedical understanding of the disease that we study. And now that is really turning into a patient benefit, as we're seeing. And one of the things that's been, really obvious to me, particularly from work with industry and with the FDA, is that it's created this virtuous cycle where progress in cancer then leads to enthusiasm and innovation and advances for better outcomes. And that fuels more enthusiasm and more industry investment. And we're now seeing this go over and over again. And I think that's really become a remarkable driver of the progress in cancer. So this is where we were in February 2020. We were in an extraordinary time in cancer research, rapid progress, still a lot more work to do. We still have a lot of ways to go in terms of cancer science, but in a good spot from my point of view in terms of the research enterprise. And then the pandemic happened, and this has clearly disrupted things. And I'd like to talk a bit about that. If you could put the slide down now, please. So this is what we want to get back to, this state of remarkable cancer progress. And I believe, I'm sure, that SARS-CoV-2 is going to be gone soon. Maybe not soon enough, but it is going to be gone soon. And then we really want to get back to working on cancer, which, despite all of this phenomenal progress, it's the disease that still kills nearly 600,000 Americans a year and is the leading cause of death from disease for Americans under the age of 65. And I think, because of things that we've done during the pandemic, our community of cancer researchers and caregivers and labs and universities and hospitals, they are well positioned to recover from this current storm and embrace these new challenges on behalf of patients. So that's really, from my point of view, what 2021 is going to be about. It's going to be about reascendance of cancer research, this return to rapid progress, really, for want of a better term, getting our groove back. Let me now talk about things that we've done to preserve research during the pandemic. Since the pandemic produced great disruption to research operations and clinical care, the NCI felt it really needed to do a number of things to try and make the pandemic less bad for cancer research and cancer care. And so I'll mention a few of those things. So, for example, clinical trials is a very important aspect of cancer care. It's how new therapies are tested for patients with cancer. It's really how progress in translational research is made. And when the pandemic began, for a number of reasons, clinical trials were severely affected. So clinics and hospitals had to preserve capacity, and they had to stop clinical trial enrollment. They had to move resources, personnel who typically would work on clinical trials might be moved to coronavirus care, for example. But there were other things that created problems. And so the NCI, working with FDA, rapidly did a number of things to try and address clinical trials accrual, including allowing drugs to be shipped, oral drugs to be shipped directly to patients. So rather than having to go to a hospital pharmacy to fill the prescription, patients didn't want to go to the hospital for obvious reasons during the pandemic, and still do not. And therefore, the ability to mail drugs directly to patients is very important. We also embrace telehealth, the ability to do consent and provide care and do certain kinds of visits over the phone or over the internet. And this has been really important development for patients. And we allowed flexibilities about what a clinical trial meant in terms of a visit. We allowed some of the visits to occur closer to home. And we therefore provided ways that patients didn't have to travel as much during the pandemic. And these changes, these adaptations were very meaningful. We've now polled patients and caregivers, and they were wildly popular. Patients really like the ability to continue getting care, experimental care during clinical trial, within a clinical trial during the pandemic. And the caregivers really have liked these changes as well. I think this is perhaps one of the silver linings that we can talk more about, is that we've learned things that the adaptations that have been forced on us by the pandemic, in some instances, have provided ways of doing things more efficiently, like doing clinical trials. And so I hope that we will not go back to some of the old days of practices with regard to clinical trials. We will be able to persist and keep some of these changes that have been forced upon us. We also did a number of things for our researchers. So the scientists doing research in cancer were affected by the pandemic. So labs were closed and certain kinds of experiments could no longer be conducted. So we implemented very robust flexibilities for grantees, which allowed them to extend grants and to carry over funds and do things that they normally wouldn't have been able to do during the pandemic. And we really asked the research institutions to try and preserve research capacity in terms of maintaining scientific personnel. That is not to furlough employees, but to keep them around and have them do things remotely until research could be resumed. And we think that was a very important decision and has been largely successful. So, those were things that we did to try and disrupt the effect of the pandemics on cancer clinical trials and cancer research. And we think those have been largely successful. And now, as I said, we believe our community is well poised to resume, or already in many cases has resumed fully, this kind of research effort. So clinical trials accrual is almost returns to normal now, and certainly many scientists are now back in the lab, at least partially, if not fully. And we think that this is really important for patients, that this progress continue as before. I'd like to talk also a little bit about what we've done scientifically with regard to COVID-19. It may not be obvious to everyone why the NCI had a real moral responsibility to work on coronavirus when this pandemic started, but the National Cancer Institute has a long and very distinguished history of research in serology and virology and immunology. Some examples are, Doug Lowy and John Schiller, who were intramural scientists at the NCI, developed the human papillomavirus vaccine. Harold Varmus discovered how certain kinds of viruses cause cancer. Bob Gallo, an NCI investigator, discovered the virus that causes AIDS, and the first effective therapeutic for HIV was developed at the NCI. So, this is a topic where the NCI has a lot of research expertise and capabilities. And in serology in particular, which is the detection of antibodies related to a virus or infectious agent in the blood. So serology is probably something you've been hearing a lot about lately. It's become of national interest. It refers to the evaluation of the body's response to an infection. It's been of keen interest during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a testing, but it's not the nucleic acid testing that probably is we even hear more about, which is the testing for immediate infection. But serology testing is really to look at the immune response to the virus, and it's very important in cancer research as well, and why something we've worked on for a while. And really, serology, I think you should think about it as being able to answer three things that are very important to making public health decisions and policy around SARS-CoV-2. So first off, serology can be used for these things called seroprevalence surveys, where you look at how many people have antibodies to the infection and therefore can infer how many people have been infected. So it's a way to know at the population level prior infection in the population. And that's really important to CDC and NIAID and state public health authorities that are trying to craft their response to coronavirus based on prior infection in a region. It also helps you understand the question of who is likely to be immune. People with antibodies we think are likely to be at decreased risk for future infection. And this is obviously a topic of tremendous importance as people might want to change their behavior or change their access to a vaccine based on immunity to the virus. And then lastly, serology is very, very important for understanding if a vaccine has worked. So the response to a vaccine is one of the primary endpoints of those studies has been, did the vaccine generate a significant serologic immune response? And so being able to standardize that across different vaccines, for example, is a really important question where the federal government plays a predominant role. So given this NCI serology expertise and these very important questions that needed to be addressed, I think it was natural that the NCI would be involved in the COVID response and something that we were eager to take on in the early days of the pandemic. And one of the first things we did is we had a really outstanding serology lab at Frederick National Lab, which is the government-run, government-directed lab by the NCI in Frederick, Maryland. And that lab had been doing serology for human papillomavirus. And we've been working with WHO and other authorities to develop serological standards for vaccine response for that virus. So it was relatively straightforward to pivot activities of that serology lab to coronavirus. And then we quickly developed very high quality assays for serological standards for coronavirus. And were asked by NIAID and FDA to then take on some specific work related to the serology testing in the Frederick facility. And so what we did was we collected many samples and reagents from various labs and academic institutions across the country to allow us to create these sort of reference panels to see if a serology assay worked. We worked closely with CDC and NIAID to do this. And with these developed reagents, we were contacted by the Device Center at FDA, who asked us for help in performance testing to really see if these assays that were being developed by many companies for serologic testing worked on a validated reference panel in a government lab. So we received several hundred of these serology kits from private manufacturers that were intended for commercial use at Frederick National Lab, and we tested them for their performance and then returned those results to the FDA, who then used them for regulatory decision making. The FDA granted many emergency use authorization applications based on the NCI's results, and now high quality serologic testing is available to every American consumer based on this joint effort between the FDA and NCI. So I think that's sort of an example of a really technical thing that we can do early on with our capacities for the national good. And this has made possible individual serological testing, but also high quality seroprevalence studies, which have been used for population purposes to date mostly. I do predict individual serological testing and individual serology response will be becoming more important in greater months as we get further into vaccine efforts, and I'd be happy to discuss that topic if there's further interest. So these activities in serological research, I think, then led Congress, as many of you are aware, to appropriate $306 million in a supplemental appropriation to the NCI for COVID serology and related technology research back in April. And the specific language was to develop, validate, improve, and implement serologic testing and associated technologies. And with that funding, we've done a number of very exciting and important activities, some of which are out, some of which are about to come out. And they include things like the creation of a large network of research academic institutions with NCI funding to study the relationship of serology to the viral infection and the overall immune response. And that network is called SeroNet. And it's grants to 8 academic institutions with another 13 supplementary grants and 4 contracts. A really intricate network structure that will provide serological testing capacity nationally, but will also advance the scientific understanding of how serology represents immunity to infection. So very important, both basic research and policy driving research being done through SeroNet. We created Sero Hub, which is an online dashboard that collects and annotates all these various seroprevalence surveys that are being done by academic institutions and state health labs and various other agencies to try and understand the prevalence of prior infection in specific populations. And so now you can go onto the Sero Hub website, which went live this week, and really look at, at the geographic and even in some cases county level data as to what the seroprevalence has been estimated to be in certain communities, which, as I said, is important for planning the public health response at the at the local level. And then we have also developed a large clinical trial called NCAPS, which we stood up in a matter of 6 weeks and is now open at nearly 1,000 sites nationally, which accrues patients who have a history of cancer or who have active cancer, but also have new coronavirus infection. And so the idea is to enroll these patients, do very longitudinal assessment of outcomes, collect specimens so that we can look at things like biomarkers to predict outcome, and really try and understand what happens acutely when a patient with cancer is infected with coronavirus, and then also look at the long-term implications of coronavirus infection in this immunocompromised population. And so we think this study is relevant to things like the topic of COVID long haul syndrome, where individuals have symptoms of COVID infection well after they recover from the acute infection. So that's a very important ongoing study to understand the importance of chronic and acute coronavirus infection in a immunocompromised population. And then a lot more things going on that are really important and interesting, and I'd be happy to talk more about today. But things like the creation of serology standards. So we have made a sort of American standard reagent that will allow anybody who's interested in using a serology assay to compare their assay's performance to a validated central standard. And now we're working with the WHO to make this an international standard for serology assays. This is really important in the vaccine trials. So if you notice, Pfizer uses their assay, Moderna uses their assay, J&J uses their assay. To be able to compare results across trials requires a government standard, and we will be providing such a standard any day now. It takes a while to develop these. It's intricate work, but we have gone through it, and it should be available very soon. We also have been looking in sort of real-world databases at the relationship between serology status and future infection to try and understand individuals who exhibit antibodies to coronavirus, what their risk of future infection is. And those results will be coming out shortly. And it's a very interesting scientific effort that I think will be important to the national response to the pandemic. So these are a few examples of the really exciting sets of research that we have ongoing on to try and help get through this coronavirus pandemic as quickly as possible, so that we can, get back to doing what we want to do, which is cancer research and making a difference for patients with cancer. There are a few silver linings I would like to point out, and things that may continue, that we've learned from the pandemic that I think will be important to cancer research going forward. One obvious change that I've already mentioned is the broader adoption of telehealth. And what we've really seen in terms of how this is being used by local caregivers to provide care to patients brings up a number of very interesting research questions in the field of implementation science. So one of the problems we have in cancer research, and something that drives a lot of cancer health disparities, different disparate outcomes in underserved populations in particular, is this access issue, where patients often can't get access to high quality care because of geographic distance or because of cost barriers or other kinds of challenges. And telehealth may be a way to address some of these barriers to high quality care. And as I've already mentioned, it appears to be very, very popular with patients. And so we at the NCI are very interested in studying how telehealth is being used by caregivers and to provide cancer screening and diagnosis and treatment in various contexts within the United States, and recently announced a new funding opportunity in this topic to really try and understand how the pandemic, which has driven a robust adoption of telehealth at a national scale, how that can how that occurrence can be used for research good for our patients. And I think that in addition to telehealth, a lot of the regulatory flexibilities that have been taken on regarding the device and therapeutic approval have been favorable for certainly the pandemic response, but I think also will be particularly meaningful in cancer, where often we're studying, cancer is a heterogeneous collection of diseases, and so often we're studying tumors that are less common, and so regulatory flexibility in terms of clinical trials design is really, really important for nimble decision making and development of new therapies. And that has a big implication for the NCI, because that affects what kind of clinical trials we design for future improvement. So I think a lot of the things that we have learned from the pandemic could be of use going forward, and I'd be happy to discuss what we think those positive changes will be that will live on. But to close now, I'd like to say that this has been a very special time in cancer research, a time of great progress, although still much work needs to be done. And now we have had this significant interruption from the coronavirus, but I think we are well poised to get back to that very positive trajectory of progress for our patients to make developments that will really benefit all patients with cancer in the coming years. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for setting this up. This is very important opportunity to communicate with stakeholders, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sharpless, and for the presentation. We already have questions coming in, but I'm going to remind folks to please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask your question, and please say your name and what organization or office you're with. And there are quite a few questions actually that have come in regarding the pandemic and its impact on biomedical research generally, but specifically cancer research and clinical trials. We all know that research has been disrupted in a way unprecedented, and many clinical trials stalled or halted. So I'm wondering if you could share some examples of the ways that pre-pandemic research from basic research to clinical trials has been impacted, what that sort of will mean in the long term. How do you think this will affect early investigators, trainees, and in all likelihood, patients?
Yeah, so the impact on clinical trials, as I said, has been really significant. And while we have seen some recovery at the sort of height of the pandemic, April, May, June, there was a particularly dramatic effect. A lot of ways to measure this. One we look at is weekly accrual to trials. So the NCI runs a bunch of clinical trials through our national clinical trials networks, and we know how many patients enroll in those trials per week, and we've known this for decades. And weekly accrual to sort of our larger phase 2, phase 3 therapeutic trials, where a patient would get a new experimental therapy for their cancer, was on the order of 300 a week prior to the pandemic. And when the pandemic began, it plummeted to less than 150 a week. So a more than 50% decline in accrual. Now that has slowly crept back up, and we're back up, the high 200s, close to where we were before. But there was a big period, 6-month period, where accrual was severely compromised. And what that means is that those trials are going to take longer to complete. Some of them will never complete. They'll close because of lack of accrual. The investigators involved, their training period or whatever will take longer. The trial will be much more expensive, and that will provide costs for the NCI or whoever's paying for the trial. And then the drug or device or therapy that's being tested, if it works, it's going to take longer to get approved. It's just going to slow down the sort of pipeline for the development of new therapeutics and diagnostics. So that hit to accrual is really, really challenging. We think we can get back to the prior levels, but can we catch up? Can we sort of make up for that lost period? That's more challenging, and it's not straightforward to do that. So that is just bad news. That's, by the way, the NCI's data for therapeutic trials. There are other kinds of trials we do, like screening trials and quality of life studies. There we think the impact on accrual may be even worse. And I'm told by my colleagues in industry who run, the CROs and pharma companies that run industry trials, their statistics in accrual are even worse than ours. So, nationally, this has been a real body blow to clinical trials performance across cancer research by industry, academia, and NCI-sponsored trials. And I think the best we can hope for really is to get back to normal quickly. I don't know if we'll be able to catch up that period, but I think we can realistically, figure out how to do trials in a way that benefits patients during the pandemic. This does get to the issue, by the way, briefly on delivering care during the pandemic. And I think we really now know enough about the virus, we can do both. We can take great care of patients and do it in a way that's safe in terms of their risk of infection and the caregiver's risk of infection. So we can protect the patients, we can protect the doctors and caregivers, and also still take care of patients and run clinical trials, knowing what we know now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharpless. We have sort of another category of questions on vaccines generally coming in. And I'm going to just try to bucket those together. One, what's the current advice to cancer patients in active treatment on a COVID vaccine? The other is on NCI has a history of sort of vaccine hesitancy, dealing with HPV. Do you have any advice, thoughts? Is NCI actively involved in trying to address vaccine hesitancy related to COVID-19? And then does the emergence of very effective vaccines using mRNA have any implications for cancer research that you could talk about?
Yeah, those are all three really good questions. I think maybe the first thing to say about the vaccine response is, wow, this has gone better than anticipated. I mean, you know, when I was at FDA, we regulated the dengue vaccine as well as the Ebola vaccine. I have some experience in vaccine development, as well as, you know, the HPV experience from NCI, and I never thought things would go this well. I mean, that we would have multiple products that appear this active and this safe this quickly is just extraordinary. And I think that we really, you know, the work of both pharma as well as scientists like the Vaccine Research Center at NIAID has been extraordinary, really breathtaking. And so, you know, maybe I am spiking the football on the 10-yard line. I think we still don't have national delivery of vaccine. There's still manufacturing and distribution issues, and we still, you know, I'd like to see a bit more safety data. But having said that, if you'd asked me if people did ask me a year ago how I thought this was going to go, and I did not envision sort of this level of success this quickly. So it's surprising and remarkable. And by the way, you know, what we've learned about vaccinology is going to be important for cancer research, and I will come back to that because that was the third question. So I think the first question is, what are we recommending to cancer patients about getting a vaccine? This is really in flux. Doug Lowy, who's the deputy director of NCI, and as I mentioned, the inventor of the HPV vaccine, has a lot of experience in vaccinology and is on the sort of trans NIH, you know, Operation Warp Speed Vaccine Committee. And, you know, we have tried to make the point that particularly older patients with cancer, but patients with a history of certain cancers, should be considered a high-risk population, and given that comorbidity, would be a population in some instances we would recommend for early access to a vaccine. A lot of this is going to be worked out by the states, so the states are going to decide at the public health level what a high-risk population is. But we hope that this will include patients at increased risk of infection because of, you know, some level of immunocompromise, like cancer patients. We are having a lot of discussions about it. You know, can we use this opportunity of a widespread rollout of a vaccine to use our networks like NCORE or, you know, other kinds of access to special capabilities? Could we somehow, you know, use the fact that patients have to go to get their vaccine as an opportunity to maybe catch up cancer screening, for example, something we talked about? But all of this is at early stages, and I think nobody wants to interfere with the really critical goal of getting as many Americans vaccinated as possible once we're ready to really start roll out wide distribution of these products, which I anticipate will be soon. The second question was around the topic of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine avoidance, and as correctly pointed out, the NCI has a long portfolio of working on this. You know, when you discover the HPV vaccine, then the next problem you have is getting people to use the HPV vaccine. And so we've been working through that problem for, you know, more than a decade now. And, you know, this is, was not surprisingly an area where many of the scientists, both intramurally and extramurally, the NCI supports, who are interested in the problem of communication and education and vaccine hesitancy, really turned, you know, brought their powers to bear. And we've already, you know, done some surveying of patients, particularly cancer patients, as to what would, you know, what would be the their reservations about taking a vaccine and what would make them feel better about a vaccine. And not surprisingly, you know, there's a signal around safety that people want to know this product has been regulated properly and is a safe product and will, you know, diminish their chances of a bad outcome. And I think the good news there is that the clinical trials data has been so compelling that I think a lot of those fears have been addressed. You know, if we had a vaccine that was, you know, 50% effective or something, that it wasn't such a clear, strong efficacy signal, this would be much harder communication. But I think the quality of the products has really, as I said, been surprising, but in some ways simplifies the messaging a little bit. It's still very complicated. You know, vaccine avoidance is a complex, deeply rooted cultural topic that is not going to be fixed by a simple solution. But I think at least we have a good message to work with in this particular instance. And then the third question was on the topic of, you know, what's this going to mean for cancer research? And that is really exciting because you can see these platforms, these mRNA platforms, which, by the way, were in large part developed for cancer research, got pivoted to vaccines, and probably are going to come back to cancer research once the coronavirus pandemic calms down. But, you know, they really hold great promise for personal cancer vaccines, for example. The ability to make a, you know, a personalized vaccine that really will only work for you based on the mutations of your cancer to engender a patient-specific immune response. That's a very exciting possibility. I think these very flexible mRNA platforms will allow for that kind of testing. And so some of the industry partners involved in this research have already been trying, the application of these technologies for personalized cancer vaccines. And I think that makes a lot of sense. There are some real challenges to that kind of research. How do you design a trial for that? How do you know if the agent's working? And then there are really some really important regulatory barriers to how do you get such a product approved. But nonetheless, I think that this is something, given the tremendous efficacy of the immune activating therapies in cancer, it's really something that we have to look at now that we know that this is available.
Thank you, Dr. Sharpless. So we're a little bit over, but we have a ton of questions. So I'm just going to ask you to comment on one issue that has come in a few times, and that is the impact of COVID-19 on cancer screening. And a couple of folks have mentioned your comments earlier this year about the potential increase in cancer mortality for the first time in 30 years. And just if you could maybe close out this, and I know there are other questions, and I apologize to folks, we have a lot of questions, but if you could just comment on that aspect of the pandemic.
Sure. The pandemic has disrupted cancer care. There's no doubt about that. The data are overwhelmingly concerning. And we predicted this would happen back in sort of like March, that people might not want to come in for routine cancer screening if they were scared of a pandemic or the clinic were closed. And patients' care would be delayed by clinic closures, and certain operations would be, elective surgery, for example, would be postponed. So we have seen now, and we did some modeling that led to that, prediction in the science paper I wrote probably back in June about excess cancer mortality for breast cancer and colon cancer, which were diseases where we had the best available models. But we in no way thought that those disruptions would be unique to those two cancers. We expect all cancer care for all types of cancer to be disrupted, and that's the data borne that out. Now the data are coming in, and we've seen, screening for like mammography and colonoscopy, and during some periods has decreased on greater than 90%. We've seen delays for surgery. We've seen postponement of, very important evaluations of symptomatic patients. So, things like lymph node biopsy and, excisional biopsies of lung lesions, for example, really high priority care that we don't think should be delayed for very long. And so when you do the modeling and you look at these declines in cancer care and cancer screening, there's just no way that doesn't translate into excess mortality in out years. It won't probably be this year. Cancer's indolent enough, and we have good therapies that we can, still take care of patients with advanced disease. But, we think over the next decade, we're likely to see a 1% excess mortality across all cancers. We're trying to do everything imaginable to make that not happen. And I think that the cancer care community in aggregate has really accepted this challenge and risen up to figure out how we can make up for this missed care and missed screening and make this less bad for our patients. But nonetheless, I think that, some excess mortality we're just going to see, because delayed diagnosis means more advanced cancer, means less good outcome. And that's an inevitable feature of our field. I think we can make this less bad, but there's no way to completely mitigate the profound impact the pandemic has had on cancer care.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sharpless. That is all the time we have for questions. I'm going to pass it back to Tanaz, and thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I will echo Caroline's thanks. I think we could probably spend all afternoon asking you questions, Dr. Sharpless, but you've already been incredibly generous with your time. So thank you so much, both for participating in the briefing today, but also for all the work that you and all of your colleagues do every day.
Thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be able to do this, and I look forward to seeing everyone in real life again sometime soon.
Indeed. Here's to that. Thank you also to Caroline and to Lynn for moderating the discussion today, and for everybody who was able to join us on this briefing. We are planning to schedule another wave of briefings in the new year, so hope to see you then, and hopefully, as Dr. Sharpless said, in person eventually. So thanks again, and stay safe, everyone.